right, so are you ready to dive into Manifest Destiny? But, like, not the version they taught us in school.
Exactly.
We're going deep with this one,
Yeah.
uncovering all the hidden stories and the uncomfortable truths that we don't always hear about.
That's right.
And to guide us on this journey, we have Jorge Majfud's The Wild Frontier.
A fantastic resource.
Oh, it's a juicy one.
It really is.
It's a juicy one.
Majfud does not hold back.
No, he does not.
And so we're going to uncover his perspective on U.S. expansion.
Yeah, and we're going to see how it kind of, when you really dig into it, how it kind of, some of the things that motivated it and the impacts that it had that are still felt today, arguably.
Absolutely.
So, to kick things off,
Okay.
let's set the stage here.
Okay.
It's 1848.
Okay.
The Mexican-American War has just wrapped up.
Right.
And the U.S. has basically taken a giant bite out of Mexico.
They have.
I mean, we're talking Texas, California, huge chunks of land, right? So at this point, you'd think, okay, the U.S., they're good. They got what they wanted.
Right. You would think.
But here's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
There were actually some pretty powerful voices in the U.S.
Yeah.
who were pushing to take all of Mexico.
All of it.
The whole shebang.
The whole thing.
Not just a bite, but the whole enchilada.
It's incredible.
So my question is, why stop there?
Right.
Why not just keep going?
Well, and that's...
What was stopping them?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? Because it wasn't a moral issue.
Right.
What's fascinating is when you dig into the sources, it paints a very different picture.
Yeah.
The reasons they didn't annex all of Mexico
Okay.
were deeply rooted in, and this is uncomfortable, but it was racial prejudice.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. So it wasn't about like, oh, we've taken enough land, we're satisfied now. It was more about who they were taking the land from.
It was.
Okay, so what were they saying back then?
Yeah.
What kind of stuff was being thrown around that reveals this prejudice?
Well, I mean, you've got someone like Senator John Calhoun,
Right.
a big political player at the time.
Right.
He argued that, and I'm quoting here, that annexing all of Mexico would mean absorbing a race of Indians and mestizos, and to him, that was just unacceptable.
Wow.
So it wasn't about the land.
Right.
It was about who they believed should be running it.
Yeah, it's like they wanted the land, but not the people on it.
Exactly.
And it even gets worse, doesn't it?
It does.
Like, how much worse does it get?
Well, another senator, John Clark, he called Mexicans a degraded race.
Oh, my God.
And even went so far as to call them a pestilence on the Congress floor.
Wow.
I mean,
These were the people in charge making decisions that affected millions of lives.
they were.
And they're just casually throwing around these incredibly racist terms.
And this is what fueled Manifest Destiny.
It's eye-opening.
It is.
Because it's easy to kind of look back and think, oh, it's a different time. But this is pretty blatant, right?
Very blatant.
But, okay, if it wasn't just about the land, why not take all of Mexico? What was holding them back?
That's a great question.
Like, why draw the line there?
Well, there were also deep anxieties about upsetting the balance of power in the U.S., particularly between pro-slavery and anti-slavery states.
Right, because Mexico had already abolished slavery, right?
They had.
So bringing in that much new territory could have really tipped the scales.
Exactly. And they were very aware of that.
Wow.
Annexing all of Mexico could have significantly shifted the balance against slaveholding interests.
So it becomes this really cynical calculation, doesn't it?
It does.
Like, we want your land, but only if it doesn't mess with our system of slavery.
Exactly.
That's a chilling thought.
Yeah, it really highlights that expansion wasn't just about, this noble idea of spreading freedom and democracy.
Right.
It was deeply entangled with the institution of slavery and maintaining power.
And that's a really important point to remember.
It is.
Because it's easy to get caught up in the narrative of Manifest Destiny as this kind of righteous expansion. But when you look at the reality...
The underbelly of it all?
Yeah, it's not so pretty.
No.
So speaking of the reality...
Yeah.
How were Mexicans already living in those territories treated once they became part of the U.S.?
Yeah. Imagine being Mexican in California during the gold rush.
Right.
Not a pretty picture.
I imagine not.
No, imagine this. Anglo-American settlers, they just flood into California,
Right.
all looking to strike it rich.
Yeah.
And they're often displacing, brutalizing Mexicans and Native Americans.
Yeah, it's almost like this wave of humanity crashing down, and it's not a very welcoming wave.
No.
And that kind of resentment, that anger, it has to go somewhere.
Right? Absolutely.
And that's where I think the legend of Joaquin Murrieta comes in.
Yeah.
This is a story that feels almost mythical.
It does.
Like something out of a classic Western, you know?
Right out of a Western.
So who was Joaquin Murrieta?
So Joaquin Murrieta.
And what turned him into this almost mythical figure?
Well, the legend goes that he was a Mexican gold miner,
Okay.
just trying to make his fortune like everyone else.
Right.
But his life, it gets shattered.
How so?
Well, he and his wife are attacked by American settlers.
Oh, no.
And it's brutal.
Oh, wow.
Driven by, I mean, you can only imagine the grief, the rage, the desire for justice.
Yeah.
He turns to a life of, well, banditry.
He becomes an outlaw,
He does.
fighting back against the system that wronged him.
Exactly.
He's almost like a Robin Hood figure.
Yeah.
Righting the wrongs, fighting for the oppressed.
Absolutely.
But unlike the kind of romanticized Robin Hood we hear about, Murrieta's story, it feels a lot more,
Raw.
raw.
Real.
Grounded in a very brutal reality.
Oh, absolutely.
It's not all, robbing from the rich and giving to the poor.
Oh,
There's a darkness to it,
there is.
a reflection of the violence of the time.
And the violence
Yeah.
wasn't just like in the back alleys and saloons and things like that.
Right.
It was everywhere.
It was sanctioned by the law even.
It was.
Right.
Yeah. Take the story of Reyes Feliz.
Okay.
Young man executed for stealing horses.
Wow.
And this wasn't a unique story.
No.
Justice was swift and brutal,
Especially for Mexicans and Native Americans.
especially for them.
Yeah, it's like they were targeted,
They were.
made examples of.
They were
And with
full-
Murrieta, they didn't just execute him. Assuming it was actually him they killed,
Right.
they put his head on display
In a jar.
in a jar of alcohol.
In a jar of alcohol.
Like, that's not just about punishment, right?
No.
That's about sending a message.
Oh, absolutely.
It's about instilling fear,
Absolutely.
saying this is what happens if you step out of line.
Don't you dare resist.
But here's the thing about that kind of brutality.
What's that?
It often backfires,
Yeah.
doesn't it?
It does.
Because by trying to erase him,
Right.
by making such a spectacle of his death,
Yeah.
they turned Murrieta into a martyr,
They did.
a symbol of defiance.
A legend.
He became bigger in death than he ever was in life.
Exactly.
And that's a powerful thing.
It is.
Because it shows that you can't silence dissent with violence.
You can't.
In fact, it often just amplifies it.
It does.
It gives people something to rally around, a
Because
symbol to fight for.
it does.
And that's exactly what happened with Murrieta.
Absolutely.
He became this folk hero, this symbol of hope.
He did.
And his story, fueled by outrage and a thirst for justice, it resonated with people,
It did.
especially those who were being oppressed.
It resonated deeply with them.
And that's something that transcends time and place.
It does.
The desire for justice, for equality, it's a universal language. And it's a language that those in power would do well to listen to.
They should listen.
It's like these stories of, I don't know, like resilience. They can come from such dark places sometimes.
Yeah.
Makes you think.
It does.
And Murrieta's story, it doesn't end there.
No, it doesn't.
That's
It takes kind of a fascinating turn, actually.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
When you consider the influence of this story
Yeah.
on another iconic character,
Okay.
Zorro,
Wait a minute. Are you serious? Zorro, like the masked swordsman,
the one and only.
you're saying he's connected to Joaquin Murrieta?
Oh, the parallels are undeniable.
Okay, I'm listening.
You got two masked Avengers, right?
But-
Both fighting for justice.
Okay.
Both going up against corrupt officials.
In California.
In California.
Okay, all right.
Now, granted, the Zorro story, the one everyone knows, that's set in Spanish California,
Right.
but the similarities
Yeah.
to Murrieta's fight against American oppression,
Oh.
you can't ignore them.
So it's like they took this real, raw story of resistance
Exactly.
against American expansion, and they, they sanitized
They
it,
gave it a Hollywood makeover.
scrubbed away all the uncomfortable
Oh,
truths
they did.
to make it palatable for a wider audience.
Exactly. I mean, it's classic, right?
It's like rewriting history
It is. It's repackaging it.
to fit a certain narrative.
Exactly.
Which makes you wonder
Yeah.
what other stories are out there that have been sanitized or buried completely.
Exactly.
It's like we only get these, I don't know, like the Disney
Like
version.
a highlight reel.
Yeah. And we miss all the nuance, the complexity.
And the darkness, which
Yeah.
is essential if we truly want to understand history.
No, absolutely.
So while we're on the topic of narratives and
Yeah.
the U.S. kind of shaping the story,
Right.
let's shift gears a bit geographically,
Okay.
though not necessarily in spirit.
I'm ready.
We're leaving the Wild West behind
Okay.
and setting sail across the Pacific.
Ooh. Okay, where are we going?
To 1850s Japan.
Japan. Okay, so a very different setting.
Different setting.
But I have a feeling
Yeah.
that the U.S. wasn't exactly showing up with open arms and a friendly hello.
You would be right.
Right. It wasn't exactly a cultural exchange, was it?
Not exactly.
More like, hey, Japan, we're here to do business, like it or not.
Pretty much.
Okay, so set the stage for us.
Nice.
What was going on in Japan at this time?
So Japan at this time was very isolationist.
Okay.
They had very limited contact with the outside world.
And they were cool with that, right?
They were content.
They were content.
But the U.S. saw an opportunity.
Here we go.
They saw a country
Right.
rich in resources, a potential new market.
And they couldn't resist, could they?
They couldn't resist.
So enter Commodore Matthew Perry.
Ah, yes.
And his very, shall we say, persuasive fleet of warships.
That's one way to put it.
They show up in Edo Bay in 1853, and I imagine it caused quite a stir.
Oh, I imagine so.
Because this is like the equivalent of, I don't know, aliens landing in their spaceships.
It was a show of force.
Yeah, it was a message, wasn't it?
They sailed in with these massive steam-powered warships.
Which technologically was light years ahead of anything the Japanese had.
Oh, yeah, the Japanese had never seen anything like it.
And just to really drive the point home,
Mm-hmm.
they, I think they did a little cannon fire demonstration, didn't they?
Oh, just a little.
Just a little friendly reminder of what they were capable of.
Exactly, just a nudge.
A nudge in the right direction.
A little persuasion.
So, I mean, you've got to hand it to them. They knew how to make an entrance.
They knew how to make an impact.
But surely they didn't just barge in there and say, give us your stuff.
Right. Well.
What kind of justifications did they give for this?
Oh, they had their reasons.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Secretary of State Daniel Webster.
Okay, hit.
He argued that Japan was being selfish
Selfish? How so?
by hoarding their resources.
Ah, so they were overdue for a sharing is caring lesson.
That's one way to put it.
Okay, and what resources were we after, specifically?
Well, coal was a big one.
Coal, of course.
Essential for fueling those steamships.
Right. Got to keep those ships running.
Exactly.
So it's not about conquest. It's about, what was it, manifest destiny. Spreading freedom and democracy.
You know it.
All powered by Paul, apparently.
Well, Webster did say that these resources were a gift from Providence.
A gift from Providence.
It's for all mankind, not just Japan.
Of course, the old we're doing it for your own good argument.
A classic.
Dressed up in fancy diplomatic language.
Exactly. It's all about framing, isn't it?
It is. It always is.
You come in with the big guns,
Right. Literally.
but you make it sound like you're doing them a favor?
You should be thanking us for prying open your markets. Japan, we're doing it for the betterment of humanity.
Pretty much.
It's incredible.
But here's where it gets interesting.
Okay, there's more.
Despite the thinly veiled threats,
Right.
there was also this sense of, I'm hesitant to even say it. Say it,
Admiration
for Japan.
for Japanese culture.
What?
It's in the U.S.
Really?
Yeah.
That's so interesting. So it wasn't just pure aggression.
Not entirely, no.
Tell me more about this admiration. What was it about?
Well, Americans were fascinated by Japanese art,
Okay.
craftsmanship.
The culture, in a way, it fueled this desire to, to open Japan up,
You get their hands on it.
to gain access, to experience it firsthand.
It's like this weird mix of, I don't know, like wanting to possess something and admire it at the same time.
Exactly. It's this contradiction
Yeah.
that you see throughout history.
On one hand, you've got the force of the U.S. Navy.
All right.
And on the other, this almost romanticized view of Japan.
It highlights the complexity of history.
It's never black and white, is it?
Never.
There's always these layers.
There's motivations.
So what happened? Did Japan just cave to the pressure?
Well, facing the might of the U.S. Navy,
Right.
they eventually did.
Okay.
In 1854, they signed a treaty
And that was that.
that opened up their ports.
To U.S. trade.
The U.S. trade, it was a turning point.
It was a turning point for Japan and another win for U.S. expansion.
It was.
But this time, it wasn't just about military might.
No, it was a mix of gunboat diplomacy
Gunboat diplomacy.
and a touch of cultural fascination.
It's so strange how those two things can go hand in hand.
It is, but that's the thing about this period of history.
What's that?
There's this pattern.
Okay.
Private interests, they push the boundaries.
Seeking gold, new markets.
Exactly.
And when they meet resistance,
The U.S. government, they're quick to step in
with the full force of their
to
military,
protect those interests.
it suddenly manifests destiny. It doesn't look so, I don't know, righteous anymore.
No, it doesn't.
It's less about spreading freedom and democracy.
Less about that.
And more about...
So power and profit.
It really makes you think about all those stories, the ones that get lost or twisted along the way.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder that history isn't just dates and names in a textbook. It's about people.
Real people with real lives caught up in these huge events.
Exactly. And we have a responsibility to try to understand those experiences, even if they're uncomfortable.
So we've seen how the U.S. threw its weight around with Mexico, with Japan. Any other examples from this era?
Oh, plenty. The 1850s were a busy time for U.S. expansion.
I bet. What else did they have their sights set on?
Well, in 1855, just a few years after Perry's little visit to Japan, we see a similar situation brewing in Paraguay.
Paraguay. Okay, South America now. What happened there?
The USS Water Witch, an American naval vessel, was surveying the Paraná River.
Surveying, so not exactly a hostile mission, right?
On the surface, no. But you have to remember, the U.S. was all about expanding its influence, its access to new markets.
And I'm guessing the Paraguayans weren't too keen on having a U.S. warship poking around their backyard.
You'd be right. Things escalated, and a Paraguayan fort ended up opening fire on the Water Witch.
Oh, boy. And knowing how the U.S. reacted to perceived slights in the past, I'm guessing they didn't just let that slide.
Not a chance. The U.S. demanded apologies, reparations for the damage to their ship, and, of course, favorable trade agreements.
Sounds familiar. So did Paraguay just cave in?
Well, they were facing a much larger, more powerful military force.
Right. Not exactly a fair fight.
No.
Yeah.
So they agreed to pay a hefty indemnity and grant those trade concessions.
Another win for U.S. interests. But not without a cost. It's like this pattern keeps repeating itself.
It does, doesn't it? And it tells us something important about how the U.S. approached expansion during this period.
What's that?
It wasn't just about grabbing as much land as possible. They were strategic.
They picked their battles.
Exactly. They chose targets that offered the most reward with the least risk.
It makes them seem even more calculating, doesn't it?
Perhaps.
Yeah.
But it's a reminder that even when we're talking about powerful nations, there are always limitations, calculations being made behind the scenes.
It's not as simple as just, we're the strongest, so we get what we want.
Never that simple. There are always other factors at play.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Manifest Destiny, what's the one thing you hope listeners take away from this conversation?
Question everything. Question the narratives we're told, question the motivations of those in power, and seek out multiple perspectives.
Because history is never black and white.
Exactly, and it's often in those shades of gray, those uncomfortable truths, that we find the most valuable lessons.
Well said. And if you're looking to explore these ideas further, highly recommend checking out Jorge Majfud's The Wild Frontier. It's a real eye-opener. And as you delve deeper into these stories, ask yourself, who benefited from this expansion? Whose voices were silenced? And how do these events continue to shape the world we live in today?